if each of you would take 2 minutes and be specific about one result from eating animal products that you want to speak about. So let's talk about 6 different things. We'll just go one thing, and if a person mentions one thing, then the next person mentions something else. And each of you take one specific aspect from the consumption of animal products that you would like to address and make sure we're all completely aware is happening.
Let me go first? Sure. Yeah, sure. I think it's a great idea. First of all, I think if I don't do anything else by being here tonight, I think I'd like to make the point that, and I appreciate everyone's opinion, I think that I'd like to make it very clear that because of the recognized planetary boundaries that we've already surpassed, and because of all aspects cumulatively combined, in other words, of global depletion, all those aspects of our unsustainability, I'd like to make the point that the path toward our sustainability, which I would like to call, again, more optimal sustainability, is not just to survive, it's to thrive and to flourish, given the timelines that we're on, is not an unnecessary path from point A, which is consuming animals indiscriminately, to point B, which is fully more optimally relatively sustainable systems, which are fully whole food, plant-based systems agriculturally. It's not going through the middle point, which is from industrial farms to grass-fed operations. In many ways, on many levels, grass-fed operations, which are getting away from industrial farms, are less sustainable, whether it's talking about land use inefficiencies, freshwater use inefficiencies, the production of greenhouse gas emissions, the loss of biodiversity, higher feed conversion ratios. For all those aspects, we do not have time to move from the point of indiscriminate eating of animals with industrial methods and grass-fed methods in the world to go through that unnecessary path of eating less meat. And I can safely say after the last 2 years of spending hours and hours and hours in think tanks and with some of the most highly reputable scientists at Cambridge and Oxford and world leaders and conservation groups, this path towards eating less meat but making it seem to be sustainable, when in fact, in an optimally relative sense, it's not, factually, is not going to work, and that's, we don't have the time to do that. So there's got to be a fine line of how we don't scare people necessarily into some type of unnecessary reaction, but we have to make it very clear about the timelines and the proper path, which is not giving somebody a route to a less sustainable path toward grass-fed systems, whether you want to call them regeneratorians or syntropic agriculture or agroforestry with various forms of livestock. It really doesn't matter whether it's in the developing world or developed world, and that's another thing that's part of this, is that the other aspect is that, right, our decisions that are made in the developed world are powering those systems in the developed world. And so anyway, if there's anything that I could drive home, that's it.
My comment on that topic is about climate change. In 2009, the UN came out with a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, and they reported that livestock accounted for 18% of greenhouse gases produced by humans. And that was about 30% more than all of transportation combined: cars, trucks, buses, airplanes, everything. And that's a big number, and knowing we can change what we eat, we certainly can't get rid of automobiles and everything, since most people in the developing world are just starting to drive for the first time. So that caught my attention. And then in 2009, 2 researchers from the World Bank did a study and investigated a lot of factors that the UN people did not investigate. Their conclusion was that livestock account for at least 51% of all global warming caused by humans. And at least 51% means it's livestock's causing more than everything else put together. So that really caught my attention. Now, of course, a lot of people disagreed. People in the animal food industry disagreed with that 51% number. And of course, the FAO actually reduced their 18% number to 14. But whether you think it's 14, 18, 51, or 30, or 40, whatever it is, I contend that changing what we eat is about the only primary driver of climate change that can be changed, that's even possible to change. Those same researchers from the World Bank, Robert Goodland, shortly before his death in 2013, he said that the only remaining pragmatic way, by the way, he was the first environmentalist hired by the World Bank, spent a career of 23 years there. He was not a vegan food kind of guy. He was just a scientist that cared about doing the right thing for the world. And he said the only remaining pragmatic way to stop climate change is for us to replace 50% of all of our meat calories with plant-based calories, and do it very quickly, because at the time, scientists were projecting that the tipping point for climate change would be hit between 2016 and 2020. So I believe that climate change is that one huge elephant in the room that exacerbates all of the other environmental issues, and therefore that by far is number one in my mind when I think about our need to convince the world to start moving in the other direction in terms of what we eat.
Okay, last time I started with biodiversity and then moved into some discussion of dietary change. This time I'm going to move in the reverse direction. So that trajectory of meatification that I was talking about, if right now the average person on Earth consuming about 43 kilograms of meat per year, by 2050 projected to be over 50 kilograms. If that increase does indeed materialize, that will will be driven by almost entirely industrial livestock. That's the projection. And almost entirely industrial poultry and pigs. That will involve about 50 billion more animals killed for food every year. Again, because poultry is so central. Right now, there's over 70 billion animals killed for food every year. In 1960, there was about 8 billion killed for food. Now it's well over 70, and I have a new paper that just came out called Towards 120 Billion. And this dietary trajectory that I'm talking about, that's the trajectory we're on. By 2050, there will be 120 billion animals killed for food every year if meatification continues. So this is, again, the story of animal lives. And those lives are increasingly confined and miserable and full of suffering and violence. Now, moving back the other way to biodiversity. There's a lot of research now in conservation biology that suggests the crisis of biodiversity is even deeper than the extinction spasm. So I'd mentioned the sixth extinction spasm, which there's overwhelming evidence that we're now losing species at a rate that far exceeds the background rate, which is what the term spasm is meant to connote. And now there's a term that's growing in conservation biology that's called defaunation, that's saying, yes, extinctions are happening at a very drastic rate, extinctions and vulnerability to varying scales of extinction risk. But even deeper than that is the loss of animal life in ecosystems. So there is many non-threatened species, non-endangered species that are suffering drastic collapses across a whole range of ecosystems. And there's a whole body of literature that documents these empirical trends of the defaunation trends of declining animal populations across a whole range of world ecosystems. And so the defaunation, I give this term, following another conservation biologist, the landscape of ghosts. Landscapes are being, losing their animal populations. And again, so a way of understanding the loss of biodiversity that runs even deeper than extinction risk. And the parallel to that ghosts is that we have exploding populations of animals. And exploding populations of animals in everyday lives, people are consuming them in greater volumes than ever before. But they're vanishing from their lives. They're in many ways, their consciousness, their connection to animals, their ability to see them. Like David was mentioning, 98% of livestock production in North America comes from factories. People don't see the animals, they don't understand how they live. And so there's this growth of animal lives at the same time as there's this physical and psychosocial distancing that's happening. And so I use this term things. The animals are becoming things in the sense of moving towards purer and purer living commodities. So this ghosts and things, I think, are two major trajectories of animal life on Earth. And I think, and this is one of the things I spend a lot of time working on, is the huge command that animal agriculture has over the world's land area, both as in pasture and also in terms of arable land, is a huge force in biodiversity loss. And so the landscapes filled with things, not just what I call these islands of concentrated animals that are hidden from sight, but the fact that they command these huge oceans of monocultures. There's those landscapes, and then also the huge area of pasture, which is much bigger than cropland on a world scale. Those landscapes, I think, again, I think that this is a very momentous part of the trajectory of environmental change on Earth, is these landscapes of expanding landscapes of things that are hidden from sight, animals commodified, and then the landscapes that are being depopulated of other species, the landscapes of ghosts.
So we have a mixed audience of people who are relatively new to these subjects and then people who are quite advanced, and I'm going to try to address both of that. So I just want to start off with the fact that animals eat much more food than they produce. And to just start right there, so if that's new, especially to maybe our video audience, that animals eat much more food than they produce. So when we're talking about 70 billion plus animals being raised and killed annually for food, that's just land animals. That doesn't include the aquatic animals, which are counted in the trillions. That is consuming a vast amount of our global resources. That's where we're getting the land use. We're getting massive deforestation. And we need to think about, if we had a hamburger patty that's 100 calories, that hamburger patty could be more than 1,000 calories worth of crops consumed to feed that cow. And if I would like to, really, if I would say one of the things I want to talk about is talk about the real truth about numbers. So this is the Real Truth About Food conference. I would like to talk about the real truth about numbers, because as staggering as the numbers that we talk about here are, a lot of times we are actually using the more conservative numbers. So again, we're talking 70 billion animals. That doesn't even include the trillions of aquatic animals. When you're hearing numbers about the 18% and 14% and 50% for the methane emissions, those are incredible numbers, but even those could still be conservative. So one of the reasons that the 51% number, that was a remake of the 2006 UN report that they did. So they actually took their own statistics and they counted things that weren't counted. But one of the most important things in my mind that they did, maybe not fully, but just a very staggering thing, is that UN report did their span. Their numbers were over a 100-year time period. And like we were saying, we don't have 100 years. We can't count over 100 years. Methane over a 100-year time period is about 20 to 25 times stronger, more powerful of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. When you shrink that to a 20-year period, that number jumps to 84 times. It was 72. If you've heard 72, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has now increased it to 84. 84 times more powerful of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. If you shrink that to 5 years, it becomes 100 times more powerful of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So while carbon dioxide takes up more space, there's about 5 times more carbon dioxide molecules in the air than methane. Methane over a 5-year time period is 100 times more powerful, so it's 20 times more powerful. So I would love to get to the real truth about numbers. And again, we have to lean conservative sometime, but when we have time to break those numbers down to really do it. And I know we're not supposed to repeat, but I'm going to repeat Dr. Oppenlander's grass-fed. So a lot of people think grass-fed is the answer, or humane, less cruel meat. No such thing as humane meat, first off, but grass-fed is not eco-friendly. When you are grass-feeding cows, their methane production actually triples to quadruples. Grass-fed is not eco-friendly. Let me say it again. Grass-fed, cows eating grass, because they are a ruminant animal, they have a 4-chamber stomach. When they're eating grass, their methane production just naturally increases 3 to 4 times the amount as if they're grain-fed. So I don't want that used as an excuse to factory farm them, because then there's a lot of energy inputs, and then they're using crops and monocultures and deforestation. So when you hear about the massive monocultures and deforestation going on in Brazil and other places, you also just remember that the one big thing we have to fight greenhouse gases, most of our work is trying to reduce our emissions and try to bring less greenhouse gases into the world. Our main tool for fighting greenhouse gases is photosynthesis. And for that, we have to reforest. Instead, we're deforesting. So we're clearing out the forest, we're putting their cows there, they're emitting all this methane, then we're losing our photosynthesis for crops, for factory farming. So greenhouse grass-fed beef is not eco-friendly. And every time we eat meat, again, because of how much it takes, because it takes its unfair share. So I want you to think of meat as a form of waste, meat as a form of overconsumption, meat as a form of redistribution. Anytime we're eating meat, think of us as outbidding the world's poorest of the poor. We have low-income countries, people where starvation and hunger-related causes are exporting food to be used as feed, or they're actually the animal products themselves directly, while their own people are starving. This happened in Ethiopia during the famine. It continues to happen. It is standard operating procedure. So every time somebody's eating that hamburger, they are eating grains that could be used. So it's the prices, but then also literally just bidding away from the poorest of the poor. So reforest, and just really think about what the actual crop caloric content of your food is. It's not just how many calories. Think about what the crop cost actually is. And go to Humane Facts. Oh, come on. Yeah, I know, my friend. Okay. I know. It was my fault. HumaneFacts.org has more on this. HumaneFacts.org.
I'll just follow up by saying that a lot of the facts it's very clear that this is an inefficient, harmful system using an enormous amount of resources that could be used much more wisely to feed far more people. So why are we doing it? It doesn't make any sense. It's completely irrational. So I think the main point I want to make is that human beings oftentimes act irrationally. We're primarily emotional. And that can be okay, but it's also important for us to look at reality and try to make reasonable decisions based on it. And so, but why do we eat meat? Why are we driven by this desire? And it partly is why there are projections and expectations that as different countries become more financially powerful, that they're going to be eating more meat. Why is that? There's a book out called Meat Hooked, and one of the points that the author makes in it is that meat essentially represents power. Because if you can eat meat, and kind of feeds a little bit on to what Dawn said here, you can control resources. You can control and own animals. You can control other people. And a lot of times, countries who have not had very much, and people who have not had very much, feel that when they eat meat, that they have arrived. And so we need to look at this, I think, emotionally as well. And, one of the things that's been said over and over is that power corrupts. And I think in our meat industry, it has been a real corrupting industry, and it's corrupted government, it's corrupted individuals, it's really kind of about power and control over others. And I also want to touch on a little bit what Tony said about the ghosts and the things, which I think is a very interesting point, because we have a loss of biodiversity, and we also have more lives. But a lot of these Domesticated farm animals have very limited genetics. It's sort of like monocrop plant crops. We have monocrop or limited genetic diversity in our animals that are mass produced on these factory farms. So one of the things that we need that for health and well-being on our planet is diversity. And we can learn from different ideas, different genetics, coming together, create more health globally, and we're losing that too. And that's also a reflection of power and control. You have certain companies that will patent seeds or patent certain animal genes, and then they own them, so they kind of have an interest then in producing more and selling in our country and beyond. So a large part of this has to come down to power and the emotions around that and giving that up and ultimately making rational choices that serve the broader interest as opposed to more selfish perspective that I want to get mine. And so this is the kind of emotion that's at the heart of this whole thing. People are afraid they're not going to get what they need. And so sometimes the meat is a reflection of that they have power. And so there's that whole subtle thing that's part of this whole issue, I think.
I'm not sure what else to add. I may be a bit of a Debbie Downer here. As a realist, I think only 7 to 10% of the American population is vegetarian, I believe today, which means 9 out of 10 Americans eat animal products, and this is the United States. We need to be realistic. We can't just say, don't eat meat. That's not going to do it. It's like Nancy Reagan saying, just say no to drugs. That didn't work. I lived in the third world. I've lived in Africa. I've lived in Latin America. I lived in places where people do subsist on rice and beans. And yes, they would like to have some chicken once in a while. And I have a difficult time as a first world person in a wealthy country wagging my finger at them. I have a difficult time wagging my finger at Americans who choose to feed their families meat. That doesn't mean the meat is good, but we're not going to stop this tomorrow. It's just unrealistic. And I understand that grass-fed animal production has its problems, but we need to think in terms of steps. We need to think in terms of bridges. We need to think in terms, unfortunately, of progress that takes place, again, step by step. And it's difficult for me to tell people meat is evil, so don't eat it. I don't think that's the right message to tell people. And I don't have the answer. Now, that said, and again, this is not going to be a popular thing to say, but plant-based agriculture has its own problems. We have things like Roundup, which is used on food crops. That product is now getting into the water supply. It's a known endocrine disruptor. It hurts wildlife. It can cause neurological developmental disorders. We need to think about our entire food supply. This is not just a matter of raising meat. And other things like palm oil in Indonesia. I write a lot about wildlife. I write a lot about endangered species. And we're destroying the jungles of Indonesia, and the orangutans are now becoming extinct in our drive for palm oil. So again, it's not just the fact that meat is bad, it's the fact that all of our food production systems are not sustainable. And again, I'm not going to say that I have the answers. My last book was about killer whales. It was about SeaWorld, but I also wrote about killer whales in the ocean. And the southern resident killer whale population in Washington State is critically endangered. We may lose them in the next 20 years. One of the reasons are all the dams on the rivers, for example, the 4 dams on the Snake River, which are used not only for hydroelectric power, but to irrigate crops that feed people. So we're growing plants in Washington State, in Idaho, and Oregon, but we're killing orcas in order to do it. So I know it's very depressing. I'm just saying that there are no easy pat solutions, and we're not going to get there overnight. We need to think about all forms of food production. But I will say there's also a direct impact on wildlife from animal agriculture. And the one that comes to mind, I write for a website, takepart.com. I do a lot of writing about endangered species and wildlife. And the state of Washington just authorized the elimination of an entire wolf pack, 17 members of a highly endangered species of gray wolves in Washington state, because 2 cattle ranchers were having their cattle attacked by these wolves. And these ranchers are renting public land for very, very low prices to graze their animals in national forest. And that national forest belongs to us. And those species, and particularly those endangered species in that national forest, belong to us. So to kill wild animals in order to protect not just domestic livestock, but the profits of the people raising that domestic livestock, I absolutely agree is wrong. I think if people were more cognizant of the true cost to the environment and to other animals, and as I mentioned when I first started speaking, to humans who live near animal agriculture, things might change, but it's going to be very, very incremental. I don't think, well, it's depressing to talk about because we are running out of time, and global warming is real, and methane emissions are real, and they are competing with carbon dioxide in terms of hurting our planet and our environment. But I just think we need to be realistic and take a very cold-eyed approach to this, because just saying something is bad is not going to change public opinion, whether it's in this country or in developing countries.